Staying with that story, and James Norton is a Republican strategist and former senior official at the Department of Homeland Security, and he joins me from Washington now. Good evening to you. How do you read the departure of Sean Spicer?
Well, it's not unusual for press secretaries to come and go, especially in the modern age. There's been a lot of different times. Bill Clinton replaced George Stephanopoulos as communications director, and Dee Dee Myers very early on in his tenure brought in David Gergen, a Republican strategist. So I think from the perspective of him leaving, it's not exactly a shock from a staff perspective. However, as you just mentioned earlier, Donald Trump is essentially dual-hatted at the White House. He's commander-in-chief, and he continues to be the press secretary with his Twitter feed getting messages out. So I think, from that perspective, not much has really changed.
What do you make of the president actually, being quoted as saying that Sean Spicer became more famous than he did, and that was something that he didn't appreciate?
Well, I think that, Sean Spicer certainly was getting a lot of attention. Saturday Night Live and, other mediums were certainly taking shots at him and his role. And, obviously it is a difficult role. I think there seemed to be a little bit of a disconnect between what the press office and information that they have and the White House has in terms of their messaging. And I think we see that every day in terms of the Twitter feed and what the president decides to discuss that particular morning. And so, it's possible there could be some internal rivalries in there. But I think at the end of the day, it was a difficult position for him to have in that role, given that the media and the comms seem to be coming from somewhere else.
There has been quite a bit of movement, though, in the Donald Trump administration. All the while, the spectre of the Russian investigation hanging over him. How do you think the administration is dealing with that, and what do you think the end game will be?
Well, I think the administration struggles to have a clear, defined strategy, exactly how to manage this political crisis, which is really what it is. There's multiple investigations going on in Washington, and there doesn't seem to be really a point person within the administration to kind of deal with this. Donald Trump Jr. had his kind of email issue a few weeks ago and released those emails, probably out of frustration. However, it just caused another round of discussion on this topic. So I think that, despite some shuffling yesterday, what they really need to do is figure out what is the strategy to deal with this crisis, and then that hopefully would allow them to actually move forward on other parts of their agenda, like healthcare, like taxes, and budget. And I think the longer this crisis drips, and it is a slow drip, the more trouble they're going to have going forward.
I spoke to a professor of American politics about an hour ago, and he was saying that he can see Donald Trump disappearing. He'll be gone within a year. That was his prediction. He saw this as being the beginning of the end. Would you agree with that?
I think that his demise has been predicted many times, especially, he took the initial elevator ride two years ago to declare his presidency. So I'm not sure that, he's going to disappear from the world stage just yet. However, in terms of being a successful president, I think that continues to be an issue that he's going to have to deal with if he actually and does want to deliver on his economic pledges, his immigration pledges, and his healthcare pledges. I think the longer some of these other issues and kind of sideshows go on, that'll really impact whether or not he can achieve success.
What about the Washington Post claims, though, that Jeff Sessions did discuss the election campaign with the Russian ambassador? He previously obviously not mentioned this at all, and this has come to light now. How do you think the president will handle this?
Well, I think, at first we have to really consider the source and understand whether or not the Russians actually knew they were being tapped into, if you will, when they were having these discussions. A lot of times, foreign governments will kind of tip their hand and put information out there if they know somebody else is listening, and especially misinformation. So I think, not having seen the actual intelligence document, until we actually know what the information was and how true it may or may not have been, I think that's something that's still going to need to be looked at and discussed. So I think, the president's probably right just to kind of offer a little bit of calm in the sense of Jeff Sessions and his comments and his credibility and understanding the exact source of where this information came from. So I think it's kind of a little bit of a to-be.
But within the context of that, we've seen the president tweeting about his complete power to pardon. There are speculative reports that he's considering presidential pardons for members of his family and potentially himself.
That would probably be a little bit premature. It might be a pretty big political misstep if he were to, go in that direction, given the fact that, there are so many investigations going on. I think that, there's a lot of folks in town that would just like to see this investigation continue and just essentially clear him up, if you will, or clear up the White House, and so they can move on. And so I think that from the perspective of, allowing this investigation, allowing Director Mueller to have an opportunity to kind of look into these charges, and if there's no issue, then there's no issue, and everybody can move on. So I think some of that pardon discussion isn't the best discussion to have at this point. Now, there was a lot of discussion during the 2016 election of whether or not President Obama should pardon Hillary Clinton. Ultimately, he didn't, and even George W. Bush had some pressure to do some pardons on people like Scooter Libby. So I don't think it's an unusual discussion, but I think from a political standpoint, it could be a pretty big risk to go in that direction.
Just very quickly, is your prediction that President Trump will be president, say, in 18 months' time?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there's any reason to think that he won't be president. I think, again, it's a matter of whether or not he'll be successful in actually passing legislation and achieving the goals that he set out. I think that'll really dictate not only this term or whether or not he chooses to run for a second term, and also impact whether or not the House and Senate remain in Republican hands, which, at this point is still up for debate.
Okay, James Norton, thank you very much for speaking to us, Republican strategist and former senior official at the Department of Homeland Security.